What's splashing? Welcome to season 5, episode 9 of Siren Sundays with me, your host, Lashanti the Siren. This show is focused on speaking with researchers, scientists, and practitioners of environmental science and all things conservation. You are now tuning into the conservation conversation, and today's guest is Dorlan Curtis Jr. Welcome, Dorlan.
Hey, Lashanti, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on. I know this is the second time that you've been on the show in the same season. So, can you reintroduce yourself? What's your name? What do you do? And where are you working at?
So, my name is Dorlan Curtis Jr. I am currently one of the co-founders of FoodPost Farms in North Eleuthera. Um, a lot of my work, just kind of outside the farm, I'm also assistant director of research at the Cape Looper Institute, so at the Island School. So, I have been doing mostly my work in mycology and waste management, kind of been dabbling in material design and sustainable materials. So my kind of area of study or looking at how do we actually produce materials from just bio waste, and most of like the work that I currently focus on the farm is looking at regenerative agricultural systems. So how do we incorporate essentially green waste and food waste into actually repurposing and recycling into fortifying our food systems. So yeah, but
Nice.
kind of day to day, besides being at the island school with Food Post Farms, is what we currently do there is obviously focusing on egg production, and then looking at just recycling green waste primarily. So yeah.
So, share this again because I know you did in the last episode, but a little bit to this point here as far as like your education and experience,
Pardon?
your journey to this point here.
Oh, so my journey to this point. So I grew up in Nassau, and as most, I guess, living on an island, you know, my experience with education or getting here was just constantly being bombarded with weight. So I spent a lot of my summers on Harbor Island. One of the key things is, on this, there was a huge landfill that was in the end of Harbor Island, and I was kind of always a sight for sore eyes living there. Then I went off to school in Youngstown, Ohio. I did a degree in chemical engineering, with hopes of eventually coming back and working in renewable energy, and working with just ethanol production. That didn't quite pan out the way as planned. Thinking about bioenergy in the Bahamas, that really wasn't something that was a huge focus. When I graduated college. So after that, going off to moved to upstate New York, in Syracuse, and I started this master's program in paper and bioprocess engineering, and that kind of like drawn me into the world of sustainability and looking at understanding the problems that we had in the Bahamas, when we talk about green waste. And this project or this course, and that degree allowed me to kind of marry, my passion for wanting to find solutions to green waste and like looking at technology. So a lot of my research focused on how do we actually convert like waste caseina into like fermentable sugars. And so those sugars that you would essentially produce from caserinas, you can feed to bacteria or to fungi, and they can produce things like plastics or things like biofuels.
Okay.
Um,
I got excited. I was like, sugar, like for my tea, but no.
yeah, well, not like not like sucrose,
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
a lot of plant materials they do have lignocellulose, so like just hemicellulose, cellulose, lignin, kind of the primary structure of like plant materials. But once you separate that, then you can actually start fermenting or making bioproducts. Kind of fast forwarding, a few years ago, moving back to the Bahamas and looking for work in sustainability. I started worm farming when I first moved back to the Bahamas, and that was a rather interesting thing because my parents were like, "Why are all these worms in my backyard?" Tubs of just composting worms. And then after I did that for about a year, I ended up working at the island school. And when I moved to Luthra, I met my uncle, and we were I kind of stumbled upon his farm and he was composting already. And so, my journey from, growing up to here in education was not quite linear. It was just a lot of things kind of fell into place with like passion and opportunity. And then in terms of incorporating my worm systems on my uncle's farm, I think that kind of allowed us to be a little bit more diversified in processing waste. So, yeah, a roundabout way of how did I get here, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I love when you said passion opportunity. I actually had to quickly type that because that's, I don't know, something about that phrase just sounds really nice. But so I know you mentioned it in the last episode, but what was your inspiration for starting Food Post Farms?
So my inspiration, um, so Food Post Farms, as it's known, so it was actually my uncle and his partner Sophie. So my uncle Richard Johnson. He operated the North Eleuthera landfill at one point, and so he was always in waste management. Always worked in like farming. My family, they were a family of like fish pot makers, so they would actually make fish pots from hand and fish and like farm. So they were always like kind of in the sector of like agriculture. And so my uncle had a goat as well as a pig farm. And then, after he retired from waste management, him and his partner, they opened this egg farm to produce eggs for themselves. That kind of became, a very popular thing because everybody wanted like fresh local eggs.
Yeah.
So what they ended up doing was bringing in about 300 birds from the US to kind of start producing eggs for Harbor Island. And that grew like really quickly. A huge learning opportunity in terms of understanding animal husbandry and
Mm.
how does sustainable agriculture work with livestock. So that started as just kind of a small chicken farm. My uncle was obviously composting as a way to manage the farm's waste. In raising chickens, you produce quite a lot of manure, which most people don't understand. So that was a integrated system that we had. And as I mentioned, when I moved back to Eleuthera, I moved to Eleuthera in 2019. My mom was like, "You should go and see your uncle. He's raising these chickens." So I'm like, sure. So I went to see, and I was just kind of amazed because they built this kind of farm oasis in the coppice forest.
Hmm.
I was like, I really think, the work that you do is cool, and I want to incorporate, my earthworm farming into this venture. And so the food post at that point was called SNR farming, and then
Okay.
we kind of had to take a step back and understand, what exactly is this farm achieving. So the two core things that we focused on was producing food and compost. And so by definition, we kind of came across this name of Food Post Farms, and that's kind of how it was created by, you know,
Oh, like compost, food
yeah.
post.
So that's kind of hybridizing like food production with composting. So yeah, yeah.
And so, and really interesting enough, and I know I didn't ask this in the when I said discussion points, but your logo. So I see there's an earthworm in it. Can you talk a bit about your logo? Like because is that roots there? Is it some ocean waves? Like what's in your logo?
So in the logo, so this logo is actually designed by Alan
And I think
Jones.
you have it in the slides. Maybe I should pop those up.
Not well, yeah, it's probably
In
in
the yeah, but it's
so
up there too.
yeah. So the logo, it's crazy because you always determine like what's in a name,
Mhm.
and visual identity is important. So I was speaking with Alan, kind of as a partner in a business venture about food posts, and I was just kind of going through and understanding like what do I want to visually represent the brand of the company, and in the element of the logo we have earthworms because they are one of the primary recyclers in nature and they help with soil health, and then
Mhm.
the things that you see are waves can either be like kind of pasture or like cover cropping or like the ocean because technically we are a farm that's like right across from a mangrove ecosystem, and
Ah,
then that full circle is kind of a representation of growing full circle from the soil to the land back into the soil, and that actually is a palm tree or a palm branch that actually
oh,
perimeter. So yeah,
nice.
so it was just kind of a play on like the elements that we want to visually represent and that we believe in on the farm. So yeah.
So do you want to jump into the slideshow, or do you want to talk a little bit about what the concept of regenerative agriculture systems is? Is that in the PowerPoint?
Um, I think we can talk a little bit more about regenerative agriculture and like, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
What is
so
that? I got that question from when I put the flyer out. Someone was like, "What is that? What is regenerative agriculture?" And I was like, "You should tune in on Sunday to find out."
so regenerative agriculture, it is. There's a couple school of thoughts as to what that actually means, but kind of in just like a broad definition of regenerative agriculture, when you think about regeneration, it's like the renewing or the rebuilding of like a system. And so, regenerative agriculture is basically a method of farming that involves like restoring or regenerating like our natural ecosystems. And, that's primarily emphasizing soil or organic matter as a core like belief of agriculture. So a lot of our agricultural or traditional or industrial commercial agriculture systems, the soil is never really important. It's always focusing on like producing food, like let's produce crops quick as possible. It's very intensive in terms of utilizing pesticides and organic fertilizers and herbicides. But when you think about it, regenerative agriculture, we actually look at adding soil and organic matter back into the soil. It focuses a lot on like biodiversity, which in turns helps with like carbon sequestration and improving the water cycle, as well as like adding in like climate change mitigation. So regenerative agriculture, kind of as a concept, it's just a method of like farming that emphasizes soil health and restoring our like natural ecosystems. So our agriculture systems, like they are still a part of nature,
Yes.
and I think that is the issue, is that we see agriculture as like removed from nature, and that is sometimes the issues that we have with like commercial agriculture. And when we think and we bring in the issues of climate change, the agricultural sector is actually one of the most polluting, or at least contributors to like greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. So that is one thing that regenerative agriculture seeks to like at least reverse, or at least help with like sequestering carbon into the soil. So yeah.
That is interesting. I do find that when people think about like the environment and nature, when you bring up the topic of agriculture, it does seem very othered. And we really should be thinking about how to incorporate that properly into the environment rather than treating it as if it's creating its own sort of like ecosystem. So yeah, that is super important because I find that you see some farms, maybe even just around Nassau, where the first thing they do is just clear all the land out,
Yeah.
like, and they remove all of the any sort of hilly structures. They mess up the soil, like they add things on top of the soil, and it's like, wow, this is like a barren land right now, and that'll end up being like livestock and other things like that. But yeah, I think it is important that people who get into agriculture, even if it's just gardening in your home, like make sure you incorporate it into the actual environment and ecosystem that you're already in. Um, all right. So one of the things, before we jump into the slides, how would you say your farm is different from maybe other sorts of farms around the Bahamas?
Yeah, so going back a little bit too into like, just regenerative agriculture as a system or as a practice, so, some of the core principles that that's, the pillars or the foundation of regenerative agriculture, you know, one of the first principles is obviously keeping the soil covered. That's super important because when you think about nature or living systems, everything has a barrier of protection. We as human beings, we have skin to protect us from obviously losing moisture or from external elements. Sheep, they have wool to keep them warm. Birds have feathers, obviously, to keep their body temperature regulated, etc. But what does nature have? You know, and the primary thing that nature has to keep it covered, the soil covered, are plants. You know, and so one of the key principles is thinking about keeping the soil covered. Integrating livestock. They are a part of like the natural environment. They drop manure, they help to fertilize, they help to add more organic matter and bacteria to the soil. Maintaining living roots year round. So sometimes when people come to our farm, they say there's a bunch of weeds here. And what you don't understand is like plants that are in the ground. they're able to photosynthesize to bring carbon out of the air and put it back into the soil, you know, minimizing soil disturbance. So going back to like when you talked about clearing the land in Nassau, for example, we have a tendency to just clear everything. But trying to minimize the amount of soil that we disturb, because as soon as you disrupt that, you're disrupting all the microbial populations under the soil. You're actually sometimes releasing CO2 back into the environment. Also thinking about crop diversity is important. Like, you know, in nature, there are no monocultures to some degree. So, crop diversity is a super important thing. And then understanding the context of your farm operations. So, for us, what makes us different is that, we do integrate livestock. So, we would traditionally have free ranging chickens that will help to fertilize the areas that we grow. We practice a lot of cover cropping. So, whenever a bed is like, let's just say we're turning over a bed, we would always put cover crop like beans or like okras or things like alfalfas or just like grasses, and that
Hmm.
kind of helps to keep the soil cool. As you go into the summer, if you leave the soil barren, it washes away, it gets really hot. And then what we focus heavily on is composting at our farm. you know I don't think it's unique to us per se, but I think that is at the forefront of what makes us kind of just stand out. Is
Hmm.
that composting not only for us is a way to manage our farm's waste, but it actually is a way for us to grow all of our crops. So we incorporate a lot of earthworms into helping to break down things like our manure from our rabbits or our chickens.
Oh,
Um,
rabbits.
yeah, we do have rabbits. Yeah, meat rabbits, but um,
You said
and
meat rabbits?
yes.
Like to
So
eat.
yeah, so we use rabbits to eat. Everything that's on the farm is for consumption.
Okay.
But they are also great because they do help. The rabbit manure does help with like our gardens as well. So it's everything in our farm is integrated. So there's nothing really operating in a silo. So
Hmm.
I think that's the one thing that we makes us kind of unique, is that our entire farm, it's a part of the larger system of like the coppice, but also even within the farm, our manure system is related to our composting system, which is now related to our vegetable beds. And then that is obviously used to grow cover crop to now go feed the rabbits or the chickens. So I think that is one thing that, you know, that farms everywhere should be doing more of, is
Right.
kind of integrating nature and like these principles of regenerative agriculture into their operations. So yeah.
So one of the things that I thought about when you were talking about you guys manage your waste a bit differently. I know of something that I've seen done on some farms around Nassau is they will start piling up a bunch of, I guess, some branches and things. They'll burn it. Is it's like yay or nay? Is that even good to do on a farm to
I
start
would
burning?
say I would say nay. Um, you know, um, the only benefit I would say of like burning um, wood or like leaves is that you get ash, and for plants that might need like high potassium, that's like a very
Mm,
cheap, free source of ash. But when you're burning organic material like wood and leaves, like that's carbon you're losing. So now you're now adding more CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. I mean,
mm.
oftentimes smoke if you're living in an urban environment, like
It's
so it does
annoying.
actually add. It kind of is it affects the air quality, and then you're not actually building an environment to actually put carbon back into the soil. So you're losing carbon by burning that. What we usually do with like any rubbish or green debris, we would simply just mulch that or chip it, and then that's then used either to cover the soil as a living mulch, or
Mhm.
help to keep the soil protected, or that's then used in our composting systems or like in animal bedding. So that's like, I would say, a huge no-no in a regenerative agriculture system,
Right.
is to actually burn green waste. That's like, I mean, that's a form of natural currency, is biomass. So yeah.
Right. And so I'm going to the slides, I promise. But now I have another question since you mentioned the rabbits. Do you have any challenges with managing all these different animals in this space? Like, do you ever have like a chicken and a rabbit fight?
No. So
I have to see this farm. Like, I need to visualize how you're doing all these things.
Okay, so when we first started, the only livestock we had at the time, we had chickens. They were free ranging, and so we had designated areas where they would actually run. Um, it became pretty difficult. My uncle is pretty much the primary person on the farm, and throughout the week I work in South Eleuthera, so that's about 2 hours away.
Oh, wow.
And so I commute every weekend back to the north to help with the farm, and
Wow.
you know, we we did a few courses on just poultry management, and we did a course with Cardi and Moni Luthra, and we were always trying to think about how do we still get the benefits of livestock, in a very minimal input, and thinking about space. So we had naturally transitioned to kind of like these layer cage systems. So the way that we were able to like integrate both rabbits and chickens into our farm, with through like housing them in these layer cage systems, and so that allowed us to basically have, let's say, 300 chickens in an area that might be 20 by 30. You know, in
Hmm.
a free range system, they would traditionally like need a lot of space. So for us, um, that is one of the ways that we are able to have both rabbits and chickens are through just vertical integration of livestock. So, giving them sufficient space, but with a layer cage system, you know, a lot of their droppings, their manure is basically, if they fall on the floor, we're able to like carry it away and compost it effectively. It's also easier to manage in terms of their egg collection. The chickens aren't like pooping on the eggs or cracking them or breaking them.
Yeah.
But in terms of management, like that has kind of helped to maximize the efficiency of producing so many animals in such a little space with also minimal human input. Because the big thing about running a farm is having labor to actually run the farm.
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, so we do have both chickens and rabbits. They're obviously in two separate systems.
Yeah.
The rabbits are actually integrated in our earthworm systems. So their manure basically falls to the bottom of the cage, and then the earthworms come, they eat that, and then they basically poop out something called worm castings that we would then use for making worm teas or composting teas, or even to grow like a lot of our vegetables in. So it's a pretty cool concept,
Yeah.
and thinking about integrating livestock into a farm. So yeah.
Nice. So we will jump into the slides now. I'm so excited to hear you talk about some of these things. So what are we looking at here?
So this is my uncle,
Hey,
Richard.
Uncle.
Um, so the one thing about our farm, we're literally less than a mile from the North Eleuthera landfill. So we operate on commonish land in North Eleuthera, and when my uncle started, like I said, he was at one point the landfill manager. He managed waste operation on Top Island and well as North Eleuthera.
Hmm.
So after losing that contract, um, the whole waste management system in North Luther became a huge problem, as most people can, attest to, where there was really no order at the landfill. So what you're looking at is one of the key problems that we currently face, not just with the farm, but kind of on a national level.
Hmm.
You see things like palm fronds or green waste that's like intermixed with like plastic or food waste or cardboard, and for us, it looks pretty messy, you know but that also is a huge opportunity for farming as well as for just national development. And what we did when we started the farm is we actually built most of our farm from the dump. Like we used to go dumpster diving at the dump. People would be throwing away like in plywood. you know I consider North Eleuthera landfill the Home Depot of Eleuthera, because you have, mega wealth on Harbor Island. So like hotels would throw away things and then it ends up at the landfill. And they're still usable. So we would upcycle a lot of waste from the dump to actually build the infrastructure at the farm. And we would also try to recover as much green waste as possible from the dump as well. But part of what we exist to do is to at least help to lobby change in terms of like waste segregation,
Yeah.
because not only will it benefit us as a farm because we can then get green waste or food waste delivered directly to the farm. But I think as small communities on Harbor Island or North Eleuthera, they definitely can benefit from like just having a proper waste sorting program
Yeah.
that's just standardized to like help create these smaller economies and also to prop up the agricultural sector. So yeah, I think we have some other slides here.
Me
Um,
too, huh? Right.
um, and
Next.
this is, like I said, everything is from literally my interactions in the landfill or in the dump. Um, Went through a lot to take some of these images, like literally in the midst of like flies and burning waste.
Oh,
For us, just from observation, a lot of the food waste, a lot of things that we do see at these dump sites is food waste. Just in terms of volume, um, is this food waste everywhere in these dump sites? So you go there and there's like flies and rats and seagulls, and for us, that's kind of an environmental hazard. And what we're trying to stress or to emphasize is that this food waste, when it goes to a dump site, that breaks down anaerobically in terms of the methane. And I'm sure for everyone that works in like climate science or in just like in conservation or the scientists will tell you
hmm.
methane is actually one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and that's been directly contributing to climate change. And so for us, is just seeing the opportunities that composting or regenerative agriculture can have to actually reverse some of the effects that climate change has had on our environment. So, yeah.
Right. And I love that quote: "Feed our soils, not our landfills." We definitely, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's so much, yeah. And then we do quite a lot of work, especially me when I have the time, helping out with the Green Fridays at the Harbor Island Green School. So they launched this initiative as part of their curriculum, Green Fridays. It was spearheaded by Crystal Ambrose, who we all know and love, um, at William Simmons. So on Fridays, this was about a year ago. So the groups of grades 7 to 9, they had looked at sustainability, and we would always welcome the students to come to turn compost piles. At times, we would also collect food waste from the school, compost it, and then some of that compost would obviously end up back into the school gardens. But
Mm,
I personally enjoy having the students on the farm. I mean, it's also helpful, but I think too for to get the message out there that agriculture is important in terms of helping managing waste as well as like reversing the effects of climate change. In the Bahamas. Um, you know, Composting I feel is a very low tech way of like just creating these sustainable development avenues and then helping us to meet some of these goals on a national level. But the students, they always are very like enthused about the things that they find in these compost piles or the foods that people throw away. Yeah,
that's good.
because yeah.
That's
So
good. I love this picture. I love seeing that the kids are involved and that they're excited.
I mean, so much big personalities. So yeah, but and yeah, so like I said, we partner quite a lot with the Harbor Island Green School. Um, you know, the one thing I love about working with the students is that they're the ones that they get to see firsthand, how this farm operates, in terms of collecting green waste and food waste, and actually seeing like where does the waste go when it leaves the school, and they were able to come up with a 3 bin system for the school where they would collect like compost, which would be things like food waste, paper waste, any of their yard waste of the school. They would then have their aluminum category, and then they had a general waste, so things that could not be recycled or things that couldn't be composted. So I think as a green school, like they were pretty great. It was really great working with them, and just kind of being like a just kind of a mentor for that particular group. And that's kind of what I personally enjoy is not only as a farmer, but as an educator, in terms of how can these things actually work. Yeah.
And so before I move on, and I know because we've seen this is like 4 images so far with kids, do you find that you inspire particularly some of the younger men or boys that you interact with?
Um, I would say I would hope so. I mean, a lot of younger kids, like, especially when I go back to Hub around, they'd be like, "Oh, it's the worm guy." I'm like, "Yep, that's me." So I think I would hope that I have inspired them to some degree in terms of how do we actively measure that? I mean, I think that's something that could be assessed on a longer term in terms of the impact of the interactions. But the metrics or the things that we can see is their willingness to either implement these systems either at their homes or at the school. Um, Also, just like my interaction sometimes when I go back to Harbor Island is like the things that they would talk about, or I would hear stories of them when they told their parents about what they learned on the farm. So I think,
Yeah.
you know, there has been some level of, I would say, success in terms of influence. And like I said, it's even if it's just planting the seed that, composting or just agriculture is something important, then I would feel happy that I've kind of did my job in terms of just instilling that small seed or that message. So yeah.
Definitely. I'm sure you make it seem really cool and definitely a career field that could inspire them to maybe even be one day. Mhm.
Um, I
Oh,
mean, this is kind of so when we first started off, like we were actually breeding chickens, hatching them, um, and thinking about we talked about the human input in agriculture. Like it kind of became a lot, like breeding chickens and like hatching. And so while it was great, throughout the pandemic when the world was kind of at a standstill, and we did a lot of work with just rearing poultry. I think for us was taking a step back and understand what do we currently do well, and like let's just kind of go forward with that. And so we obviously got this grant from the Access Accelerator, and so right now we're kind of in the position where we're now commercializing or starting a small commercial operation with chickens. So on the right is kind of an example of some of the battery cages that we currently house our chickens in. And for us, although it might not, seem as, lovely as chickens running on a pasture, when we think about, small island communities like Harbor Island, for example, people don't have space to have free range chickens, but people still want eggs, or people still want, protein or animal based proteins. So for us, we were able to like learn how to actually make these systems. So we actually made all of these cage systems by ourselves, and now being able to that's now a potential like industry that we are thinking about going into. But for us, we're able to produce livestock in a very small space, as well as it's a better system of like capturing the manure for our farm, for our garden, for our compost, and then it actually does help in terms of disease transmission. Like if people have not raised chickens before, like they would literally go and eat their own poop, and that is kind of where they get sick is through eating the manure or poop of other chickens. And so
wow.
you
What?
they're
I didn't
this
know.
is pretty gross. I mean, I would say gross, but that's kind of naturally that's kind of what they do. They would peck and they would they scratch. That's just part of their
Yeah.
natural functions. And so if you have a sick chicken that's sick, that's pooping, you know on the
Sick
free
poop.
range, was then being transferred to other animals or to other birds in that flock. And so what we've noticed, since we've transitioned partially to these battery cage systems, like it's been a much more efficient way of managing the livestock and managing the manure. It saves a lot of time with like washing eggs, and it's also like we've had um, kind of low mortalities. And one of the key issues that we currently have in North Eleuthera specifically is raccoons. And so
Mm,
raccoons they can't actually get in these cages.
lovely.
So we've lost quite a lot of our flock to raccoons in the past. So yeah,
Well, you said they can or they can't get in these cages.
they can't.
Okay,
They,
good. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I know I've spoken before about the brutal like the brutal raccoons. Like I didn't even realize they were that hardcore.
yeah,
I didn't think that they would attack and or eat chickens, but yeah, so they are in a safer place now. So it's happy to see, especially for these cute little chicks.
yeah. So, but yeah, so that is think there might be one more. Yeah,
Oh no,
but
that was the last one. Did you?
okay, yeah. But yeah, so that kind of encapsulates some of what we do. You know, when we think about regenerative agriculture, like, I personally believe, on one of the key principles is obviously composting, for example, like that. In kind of my experience, I think um, integrating that not only from a agriculture perspective, but just from a waste management perspective.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is super important and critical that we focus on nationally because, by volume, most of our waste is biodegradable. We think about,
Hmm.
paper waste that we have or a lot of food waste that we have. Also thinking about in our coastal environments with sea, like sargassum or like seaweed blooms that wash
Yeah.
on our shores is finding like tangible ways of processing that waste and then contributing to our food systems. So, that is like what I'm trying to stress and also trying to practice is literally propping up our food systems with waste. So yeah.
Nice. I know we do have two questions from some viewers, one of which is actually one of the questions that I wanted to ask. So Jewel Thompson Benevy from YouTube asks, hi, Dorlan, great show so far. What is your biggest challenge in your farm system, and what have you learned since you started?
Huh. Biggest challenge.
You know.
Well, I would say biggest challenge is distance because, like I said,
Mm,
I mean, throughout the pandemic, I think it was easy-ish. I think from a personal level, in terms of biggest challenges, just like the commute back and forth from like South Eleuthera to North, the amount of time that takes and just managing time. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Also, some of the challenges that we've had, in the past is, I guess, like funding. And last year there was we were kind of proud and happy that SBDC, like, they had launched funding for like fish and farmers.
love
Before that was never a thing for most farmers. Is like you had to fund your own farm work. And it's like when you compare that to other countries around the world where farmers get subsidies, you
mm-hmm.
know, I could speak from personal experience, from experience of other farmers, is that, you know, they can't live on what they make on the farm because they're not getting subsidies. So I think financial security is a huge issue for farmers nationwide, not just for us. Um, and I think some of the other challenges sometimes too um, has been just like with our landfill, for example,
Yeah.
um, just the environmental like hazards that's been presenting in terms of air quality sometimes on the farm. And then this issue of raccoons that I can't stress enough anymore. But I think that is some of the challenges that we've had. Now we've learned quite a lot as well in terms of people's reception of you know waste management and how that plays in on the farm. Like, I'm pretty appreciative of like the opportunities I've had with like the Green School and the Bahamas Plastic Movement to kind of be able to teach what we've learned on the farm or practice. Learned quite a lot about how to raise chickens. How to incubate and hatch chickens, even though we're not doing that anymore. So I think you know you I I think by just being in the trenches, like raising livestock has been a huge learning opportunities versus like seeing it on paper or going to like a webinar. It's not until you like with these animals day to day that you kind of understand the amount of work that goes into just even producing a dozen of eggs. So yeah.
So I do have a curious question before I pull the next question from the viewer. Do you see yourself or maybe someone else in the near future? Because I remember we used to have, I think, maybe two farms, like two chicken farms, to the point where we were actually able to buy, chicken from the food store from these farms. But obviously, those are now shut down. So we're back to importing all of our chicken, I'm guessing. Do you
Yeah.
see that, like your farm being that, or maybe in the future, us being able to get back to buying local chicken rather than importing it in?
Yeah, I mean, I do see myself as like a significant contributor. So I think for the start of the pandemic or during the pandemic when our food systems were like kind of in flux,
Yeah.
And people were like, wait, we're not producing eggs in the Bahamas like that anymore. Um, so there was a study, I think, or a news article that came out talking about, once when we had full food security in terms of just table eggs,
Hmm.
at any given time in the Bahamas, we had about 300,000 laying hens, like as on a total,
Wow.
country.
Yeah.
Those average farms in the Bahamas might have anywhere from like, if you're a backyard farm, might have like 10, 20. I think I don't really know much farmers that have more than 1,000 like hens by themselves. So if you
That's
think about what the country needs in terms of just laying hens, we need about 300,000 hens, like
cheaper.
laying at one time. Um, if we were to even think about 1% of that, I think um, I do want to be a significant contributor to that, but I don't think that one farm, unless they have obviously
An
um,
island.
major farming, commercial production, then yeah. So I would say definitely being a contributor, but understanding what the local demand is going to be a huge thing. So yeah.
So we do have another question from my wonderful aunt. She's asking, how easy is it to grow bananas in your backyard? Interesting
I
question.
I would say it's relatively I'd say relatively easy. Here's why: because when I think about on our particular farm, right?
Hmm.
Like I said, we have the mangrove ecosystem. Then it's our farm, kind of in the coppice, and I'm sure you know about Bahamian coppice forest. Like, is a lot of potholes and rock.
Yes. I
Um,
like that. Potholes.
like I mean, potholes and rocks and caves,
Yes.
and that's kind of where we find to grow our bananas are in the like lower levels of the
Hmm.
farm in the potholes. So I would definitely say if you want to grow bananas in your yard, maybe dig a hole so whenever it rains, that is where the water will naturally settle. And
Right.
then maybe filling in that hole with like a lot of organic material, so like maybe dead leaves, um, you know, wood chips, etc., to actually help to hold onto that moisture.
Hmm.
Um, and then, like most Bahamians in like the Family Islands, they would grow bananas near to their cesspit because effluent coming off of their cesspit is obviously, nutrient rich or high nitrogen water, and
Hmm.
the bananas will definitely love that. So, I mean, once you find a good water source, it's you create like a hole that's deep enough to kind of help to retain that moisture and
Hmm.
fill it with organic matter. It's pretty easy to grow bananas. Yeah.
Nice. So we do have another question coming in from Jewel. We may have missed this. I don't think we did though. How big is your farm? And also, what do you think is the best way to mitigate against these invasive and nuisance raccoons? This may be a touchy topic. I don't think it's too touchy.
So we
But
have So our farm is about 10 acres. We obviously don't farm on all of the 10 acres because a lot of it is actually like the coppice. So
mhm.
we've cleared down some of the land. A lot of it is still wooded because we get quite a lot of birds in that area, like a lot of warblers, a lot of white crowned pigeons, a lot of migratory birds. So, we've kept a lot of that acreage wooded, um, and it kind of helps with the microclimate there. So I would say we probably farm in terms of just footprint total maybe on like an acre and a half total of that like um, 10-acre plot, and then part of that we also compost. So we need quite a lot of space to just accept green waste, to chip it, mulch it, and then to have these piles. So I would say on total we probably farm on maybe 2 to 3 acres total of like the 10-acre plot that we currently have. Now, in terms of the raccoon situation, uh, I don't know if we want to mute the. Well, I'll just be really frank. I know this might mash quite a lot of people's toes in the world of conservation, and I think we've probably had a chat about this on other networks.
Mhm.
Um, I think what really needs to happen on a serious note is that that species needs to be identified as a nuisance species, and then there needs to be a national action plan as to like now that we've identified the raccoons as an invasive species, what is our course of action moving forward? Like obviously there we've identified the lionfish as an exotic or as an invasive species to be removed, and thankfully there is a market for that meat or for for lionfish.
Mhm.
There also is a market for raccoon meat. It might
Really?
be local. I mean, there's a local market for raccoon meat. I remember my grandparents or my granddad used to actually like butcher raccoons to eat. They don't do that anymore, but
Okay.
I mean that is obviously a protein source.
Mhm.
Um, the other ways that I think we can get creative with at least controlling the populations, and I think we talked about this, is like potentially having control hunts. So the way that we encourage people to like maybe come here and hunt, or wild, like let's just say that's
Yeah.
uh, an avenue for a tourism product, which is just hunting of these wild invasive animals, potentially, and
Hmm.
then obviously trapping more. What a lot of farmers end up doing is that they actually poison the raccoons. That might seem very inhumane, but they're not a native species to the Bahamas. They directly impact, people's livelihoods. In close encounters with humans as well as like domesticated animals, like they are dangerous and they can also transmit potentially diseases to humans and domestic animals. So I think that is a huge problem. Like, luckily, I haven't had much close encounters with raccoons, but
Right.
they are they can be really aggressive. So I think there needs to be a concerted management plan, and I've asked about that in farmer settings, and they push that question off to what are the conservation agencies doing. So maybe um, I will put that out in the ethos that the agriculturists as well as the conservationists, we probably need to communicate just a little bit more to kind of identify, to
Yeah.
act, than to carry out a management plan for that species.
Mhm.
So
See, I think an important thing to note to many viewers who obviously are not in the sector, when you think about conservation biology, yes, it is about conserving species, protecting them so they're not killed, but there is an aspect of this that deals with these invasive alien species that are detrimental not only to the animals, but like you said, just to the people that live there, that incorporates the euthanization of certain animal species. And raccoons are cute and cuddly. I think the media has definitely played a part in making raccoons look acceptable. I'm trying to also be careful with my language, but I'm a very big proponent for getting rid of invasives, and I'll say that publicly. And so I think it's because they have thumbs, man. Like,
yeah,
thumbs, so everyone thinks it's cute to have them. They want to keep breeding them. There are people that promote them as their, as a native species. They're not. They're invasive and they're not supposed to be here. But yeah, so hopefully the agricultural sector can get in cahoots with the conservation sector, because as you know, even with the history of conservation in the Bahamas, there have been instances where euthanization of particular species have had to come into play to preserve the native species in the Bahamas, like the Abaco parrots. You've seen that with the iguanas. We're now dealing with cane toads. Like, this is real, and this is a part of conservation
yeah,
that is a bit darker than the tree hugging,
yeah.
um,
I mean,
stereotype.
and I don't think the raccoons only. I mean, they definitely impact farmers or people that work in farming and agriculture directly. But when you think about like our area, like I said, we are in the coppice mangrove transition area. We
Mhm.
used to have a lot of crabs on our farm because they would come over from the mangrove or from the coppice to breed. We don't see any crabs anymore on our farm at all. And that's because the raccoons are actually eating crabs. They're going in, they're digging the crabs out of the holes. And I mean, I don't
Soft
have,
shell
I
crab.
mean, so I mean, it's actually, like I said, it's digging into people's livelihoods. Where in North Eleuthera, I mean, people can't crab anymore because there are no crabs to catch because the raccoons are actually eating or at least predating these populations of land crabs. So yeah,
Mhm. Wow, that's powerful. Because could you imagine something like that being in Andros, right? Like where we get all our crabs from.
yeah.
Um, but moving on, we do have about three more questions in the audience. You seem to have really pushed some buttons. So Denise, she asks, "What about snakes eating the chicken eggs? Is this a challenge also? Do the behavior? But actually, they
They
really they don't.
they don't eat the eggs actually. It's crazy because a couple of months ago, I've had really close encounters with Bahamian boas on our farm. And
Nice.
I love, so we love, like I said, we recognize and we understand that our farm, we are in nature. Like we're literally farming in the coppice. The coppice is the natural environment for Bahamian boas. And so we've probably came across two or three like 8 foot boas that obviously at the time had chickens in their stomach. And it was fine because that's just part of the cost of farming in nature. But
Right.
they actually don't go after the eggs. The raccoons they do, but we keep the snakes around. We obviously we keep the chickens protected so they can't get to them.
Hmm.
But when you think about regenerative systems, like the snakes are actually a population control for the rats that we have on our farm.
Yep.
So they don't eat the eggs. Snakes, they have an important role to play in our environment, and they have an even more important role to play in agriculture in terms of just getting rid or managing pests. So,
Hmm. I love.
huge component of keeping Bahamian boas, even though I'm not going to go and handle a boa because I'm still kind of afraid, but I see them on the farm and I'm like, you can stay. We just walk on a different path. But yeah.
Yeah. And I
But
think another thing to note, even if you just want to compare like the impact of boas versus raccoons, a boa will maybe eat one chicken, and that's him or her for maybe the month, for a minute. But with raccoons, I mean, they just like they wildin'. So that's also something to consider. Even when you start thinking of just impacts of like these different species on a whole. So Bahamian boas are important, guys. We do not support the killing of Bahamian boas.
yeah.
But we do have a question in from YouTube from Lindsay Rigby. Do you practice hot composting on your farm, and how do you manage your piles? And what is hot composting? What is that?
So thermophilic composting or hot composting. So we actually practice three kinds of composting on our farm. So yes, to answer Lindsay's question, we do practice hot composting. So to manage our piles, we obviously chip waste. So whenever we get, people might drop off wood or just things from their yard, we would obviously chip it down, mulch it down. So it has more surface area, like very small particles. Then we would integrate that with like manure waste and food waste. We monitor the temperature of our piles so they can get compost piles can get really hot. Like I mean, I've seen piles get up to like 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Like we're talking really hot like
Uh-huh.
piles. So the way that we manage that is we obviously water every week and then we turn the piles manually because it's still I mean, everything that we do is mostly done by hand. And then we also have a passive like aeration system. So we put piping in that to allow air to diffuse naturally. Because it is a living system. Like a compost pile is alive. There's bacteria and fungi in there that need oxygen to respire and to break down the organic material. We also practice vermicomposting, so we utilize earthworms to produce worm castings, and they are part of our rabbit operation where they eat all of our like rabbit manure, and then they also help to process quite a lot of our food waste that we collect from restaurants on Harbor Island. And then we do some level of black soldier fly larvae composting, where we take like meat waste, like fish, etc., to produce black soldier flies that can then be fed back to our chickens. So those are the three systems of composting that we produce. At the end of the day, they all produce a compost product that can then be put right back into the soil. So yeah.
And I do recall, I did have an episode like maybe 1 or 2 seasons ago with Nicholas Fox, who does like permaculture and composting, and remind me of this because I know there's a fine line between doing composting properly and then having like a bomb in your backyard. Am I repeating that properly?
I wouldn't say, I mean, I don't know if a bomb is, I I mean, I wouldn't say bomb, but like piles, they can get hot, but they do catch on fire. If you
Mm,
want like, and you think of the heat of the summer, if there's a lot of like dry material, piles, like I said, they can get up to like
until it runs something.
160, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. This is like really hot stuff. And so if you have now the sun baking on that, there's chance of that to like, to actually catch on fire if you're not actively managing like the accumulation of waste. So yeah, I mean, and then also too, if you're not balancing like your browns to greens, then you end up with like a stinky mess that your neighbors will probably be like, "Stop this." So yeah,
Right.
it's just important to know, like balancing the ratios of green and brown waste, understanding like when things break down, what happens biochemically, because if you have a lot of food waste just breaking down, it's going to smell, attract flies, etc.
Yeah.
But a lot of our piles, when people come to the farm, they don't even know that we have food in there. It's like there's no, it's like no odor. And I think that's the thing is like, changing the stigma of like composting as some nasty like system or process. But
Yeah.
really and truly, it is designed to break down food waste naturally, but just in a controlled system or process. So yeah.
Nice. I definitely next time I'm in Eleuthera, I need to come see this farm. I'm really excited to see it. And I
Yeah.
know Lindsay, she follows up with asking, very nice, is no digging, no dig farming a method employed at FoodPost?
I'm trying to see if she means like no till, maybe. I'm not certain, but I
Okay.
mean, we do minimal tilling if at all. Like I said, because we mulch a lot and we compost, so like every year we would just add a layer of like mulch on top, and then at the end of the season, that'll then break down back into the soil. So, I mean, we do till a little bit, but everything like all of our beds are basically managed by hand tools. So like
Nice.
grub hose, just like basically hose. So we don't have like tractors that are like ripping and tilling the ground. So we don't practice heavy tilling or tilling that much or at all.
Hmm.
So I'm not certain if she meant no dig, if that's what she meant by no dig, but yes.
Well, hopefully she maybe clarify in a bit. And we do have one more question. Is it true that you don't need a rooster for the hen to produce the eggs? That is an interesting question. How do you balance that rooster ratio as well? But yes, how do you need a hen? I mean, a
You
rooster.
you do not need a rooster to produce eggs. Um, Let me make this very. I'm trying to see how I'm going to phrase this. So
I feel like I know what you're trying to do.
okay, so the female menstrual cycle in humans, you know, that's a closest analogy to
Yeah,
make
no.
the female menstrual cycle. You don't need a you don't need a male to basically um, you don't need a male for your menstrual cycle to happen. You do need a male if you want to reproduce. And so in the world of poultry and chickens have a menstrual cycle every 26 hours, which comes in the form of an egg. So a hen, once they are reached a point of maturity, can be anywhere from 4 to 6 months, depending on the breed. They will lay an egg every 26 to 27 hours, and that's their ovulation cycle. So when that happens, you get a table egg. Now that will happen regardless if there is a rooster or if there is not a rooster. Now the rooster only comes into play if you want that egg to be fertilized to produce chicks. Or, for example, when you're free ranging, a lot of farmers would keep a few roosters in the flock because they tend to act as protectors for the flock of hens, or they would also give alerts to the hens if there is danger. So what I've noticed when we
Block.
were free ranging is that the roosters, like I used to get attacked quite a lot by this one rooster, like physically attacked, but they would always give off a sign or a sound if there was like a snake or a raccoon or a dog or someone coming that will alert the flock to like move to someplace safe. So to
Right.
answer the question, you don't need a rooster to produce eggs. Like
Mm.
the ovulation cycle of a hen happens every 26 hours. So there's no need to have roosters to produce
I'm
eggs.
so happy that
Yeah.
is not for humans. 26 hours, no way.
Yeah.
But just curious enough, you said sometimes you'd have a couple, some people would have a couple of roosters. I know I've
Yeah.
heard before, and then we're going to start wrapping because I just realized we're about to hit an hour. Roosters fight. So is there a minimum number or maximum number rather of roosters that you would want to have to maintain like that, like I guess that territorial
Yeah.
fighting and all that stuff?
I mean, to be honest, like for breeding purposes, people would do like one rooster to every like 5 to 10 hens, just in terms of breeding. But I mean, you can maybe get away with one rooster for like if a backyard flock has like 20 to 30 like hens. maybe one or two. Like I would say a good ratio would be like one rooster to maybe like 15 to 20 hens,
Hmm.
especially if you're not, managing like two roosters that could be potentially aggressive. I would caution doing that just for backyard farmers.
Yeah.
So, so
And I know Lindsay Rigby, I'm so sorry, it was a he, was referring to no-till. Sincere apologies. I really shouldn't have made that assumption. He was meaning no-till. So yes, it was the no-till. And he does say thank you for the insights. So as we wrap up, what sort of advice would you give to any viewers or someone who's listening later that would want to get into this type of work?
just farming in general, or I mean,
I
so
guess just similar to you, like making sure
okay,
it's very inclusive of the environment and,
yeah,
just incorporating all these different regenerative agricultural systems.
yeah. So, like I said, I would say my advice would be, I mean, just incorporating six core principles of like just regenerative agriculture. I mean, just integrating livestock as much as possible, and livestock doesn't have to be a, a cow, or it can be something as simple as rabbits or just yard chickens.
Right.
I think some of the key things are, when you think about farming, is understanding the waste that you have naturally is really going to help with like any person that wants to grow organically, or we have a country that does not have a lot of topsoil, but we have a country that has a lot of biodegradable waste. So
Hmm.
what I think is, covering the soil as much as possible. If you're Even if you have potted plants, if you're farming out in the field, is just like covering as much of the soil as possible with like organic material, and that's really going to help in terms of like erosion, water retention, and just overall microclimate. One thing that I would encourage people is like understanding the importance that soil plays in like our human health. Like if the soil is like properly managed, or there's good soil practices or husbandry practices, that's gonna go a long way for anybody that's trying to grow a farm. Is understanding the role that bacteria, fungi plays in the soil, so there is really no need or minimal need
Hmm.
for fertilizers, etc. So yeah.
Nice. And do you have any sort of like lesson learned advice that you'd want to give just based on maybe an experience you had, like a nice little quote or inspiration?
Um, I always tell my students, or like
Watch
you
out for
said,
roosters
well, watch out for raccoons for sure.
and
Uh,
roosters. Yeah.
yeah. Um, like I said, um, might have saw in the image. What I like to always say is feed the soil and not the landfill. And I think that's, it might seem like a very cheeky quote, but it's true. It's like I think as a country, we need to start feeding the soil with what is available, and not sending things to the dump site or to the landfill, and seeing the things that we produce as waste as actually a valuable resource. So that's kind of my message in a nutshell to everyone. Whether you're working in farming, I mean, gardening, and conservation, is thinking about a lot of this organic waste as actual resources.
And last one before you go. Who is someone in the sector, local or international, that inspires you and why? And I know I asked this the last time you were on the show. Feel free to say the same answer or note that person and then mention someone else.
All right, so my same answer still stands. My uncle Richard. I don't even know if he's on the call, but he'll probably see it probably. But huge inspiration, like I said. Um, Really, I mean, I can't say enough, but I couldn't do a lot of this without him. But just seeing in practice how he does upcycle and can make something out of like just waste. There are a couple other people that I think that I've either worked with, that has been a lot of inspiration. Probably more so, thank you, I would say. Definitely Crystal Ambrose and William Simmons from Bahamas Plastic Movement and from the Hopper Island Grain School. Like they are huge inspiration for me, not just as like personal friends, but as like colleagues in the realm of like conservation and education. Like, Crystal has helped giving me a platform with teaching her students about composting and zero waste, and Will allowing me for helping his students with like Green Fridays. Like, I think for us as a nation, like, just having that network, Alan Jones, obviously, as one of my collaborators, like has been super helpful but physically working on the farm and also with some of the behind the scenes things with like digital work. And internationally, like there's this one guy called like Domingo Morales from Brooklyn.
Okay.
They run this farm called Red Hook Farms in Brooklyn, and they're literally an urban composting farm in the middle of like Brooklyn. And it's crazy how like people can compost in the middle of a city. You know, I would be happy if there was more of that done in Nassau. Where you can drop off your food waste to this composting farm and then have people coming in and turning piles and like growing food. Those are the kind of the things that I want to see for the Bahamas. When you think of how urbanized Nassau is becoming, not the Bahamas, but Nassau, uh, there needs to be more of that there. And so those are the persons that I find inspiration from locally, internationally, and I want to maybe just thank on a more public note for their help. So yeah.
Definitely. And I'm hoping to someday soon, I'll put this plug out there to get Will Simmons on the show. I'm pretty sure I emailed him. And if I didn't, sorry, but I have been trying to get you on the show. So hopefully we will get to chop it up maybe next season.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's always good to thank the people that have inspired you. And I'm also inspired by both of them, especially Crystal, as you know, Crystal Ocean. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this episode. So thrilled to have you on the show again. Maybe we'll have you on the future when you start producing chicken meat, for the country. Maybe to talk about the raccoon management plan.
Hopefully, yeah.
But yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for riding this wave with us to all of our viewers. We have been a little over time, but we appreciate all the viewers. And tune in next time for Siren Sundays.
Right. Thank you.